Hey, what's up, viewer? Welcome to the first hour of Day 3 of Nebulous live development. Got the game to a point where the player can control a scanning ring, which changes depending on these UI values. That is setting the player up to be able to scan their local solar system and eventually go beyond and scan higher tiers of space. It also ties into the economy system, so it will affect the player's economy when they do scans of varying degrees. There's a few more cosmetic things with the UI, but it's functional enough and it's okay in its own right. It will work for doing some other prototypical things. At the moment, there's a purposelessness to the scanner, so we've got to add that purpose of discovering stuff in the game, which requires essentially two separate phases of mechanics. There's interspatial placement of these scannable entities dispersed rationally around the star, or the sun if you'd rather. These objects have to have their renderers disabled at the beginning and need their renderers activated upon being scanned. In the event the object requires a higher frequency, aka it's smaller, the renderer might not have to render their object because it might be too small, whatever it is, for like the intersolar system level. So the only thing that would work would be you'd have to have a UI element that gets generated on screen where the scan is hitting, and it would have to have like a radial degree, maybe like a percentage or something, signifying how much more frequency is needed to a certain extent. So like maybe it's at 75%, so the player knows they need just a little bit more frequency, or it could be down at like 25%, so they know they need like 4 times the frequency. And that allows the player to discover different entities in the game, but the entities, it's unclear how much scanning effort it's going to take to actually discover the entity all the way. So it gives the player the ability to choose between a more gradual area of effect approach or a more targeted approach. And it's another way that this game has like a solid dynamic through the scanning system. It actually creates opportunities for the player to diversify their decision making. And it's integral to needing spaceships, because you have to scan these things down, and then whatever they are typically needs some kind of ship interaction, with the exception of like the sun, basically. So the sun won't. Maybe there'll be something like solar panels or something, but for the most part, the sun is just kind of there. It's not. It's more of an interstellar marker than anything. The stuff in the system is really what makes the difference. So it's like planets in the system, and because of their size, the idea would be that they're easier to scan down. And then you could have moons, and they wouldn't be that much harder to scan down from a planet, especially if you can just get to the planet first and scan the moon locally. there's other stuff throughout the space that would require more stuff. So like floating debris, or like perhaps you could have like a comet events or something like that. You can have like the idea of like gas clouds makes sense. Gas plumes. Asteroids essentially makes sense for rare materials. There also technically could be ships. NPC ships. And the NPC ships would have to like move around often enough, which would make it tricky to scan them, because if you scan a ship and then it is moving and you just try to like do a higher frequency scan at that same spot, it probably won't work. So there's a little bit more nuance dealing with moving ships. But the idea is you could scan fleets. Somehow you would be able to... Well, I'm not sure. Maybe it would require... It might just require multiple scans or something. Multiple cheap local scans, I'm not sure. There might be a way to like lock onto a signature and zone it in or something. So it's kind of a... Having ships scannable mixes into the player being able to control a ship with a scanner, because if that scanner can lock ships, then the mechanic kind of is interwoven, so there's some consideration to be had for that. As far as other stuff in the game that you could scan down, I don't have any ideas right now. Any other ideas? I'd have to like look into some space concepts to see if there's anything else, but like outside of dust clouds and asteroid fields, there's not a whole lot out there in terms of material stuff that's scan worthy, but it's kind of cliche just doing rocks and gas. It might be enough. The problem is it will just get repetitive if it's just those two. So like if every lower tier scan is just if it's just going to be rocks and gas, then it's going to become predictable. So having a decent spread of skinnable entities would be very good. For the moment, though, I think I can get away with planets and asteroids as a prototypical goal. And so there's a few things that need to happen. I've got to there's a few things I've got to do. I have to tweak the spawning system, because for now I'm going to make it to where the arc of the scan is essentially the highest or lowest any of the random spawns can go. Right now I have the random spawns fed through the inspector with a custom, or with like a publicly exposed array in their hand defined. But actually, now that I'm thinking about that, let me take a look here. Okay, they're actually all on y equals 0, so actually I wouldn't have to... I could effectively build the discovery system without messing with the random spawning. and that would show the scan system effectively finding signatures. The main issue would be if it needs more power to scan it down. That's going to take like a UI element that gets drawn or created at the signature position, but not in game space on the screen. So there's like I gotta do like a transposition to generate that. I might be able to do it using, if I take the root element of the UI, I can probably add an element in screen space. And I can just make a shader graph that like defines a radial thing for, and it's super specific, I guess. It might just be easier to make a, just like render a circle with a text in it or something, or just render a text with the percentage. For prototypity. And then I would be able to scan stuff down by finally being able to finally code up the scan button. And maybe add a mechanic where if the player like control clicks something, it becomes an active scan target. And that's a way to, you wouldn't have to micromanage the picking the scan details. More than anything though, that's for stuff that's discovered. So that allows you to do large AoE scans, but then like pick some more specific scanning arcs once you've got a better idea of what you're looking for. And that would make the selection system, so those two things, and then I guess the third thing is the UI, generating the UI element. Generating the UI element or activating the object. Activating the object's render. I'm also going to have to set it up where it can zoom out, because the scanning rings are going to have to get bigger. Alright, so first thing I need to do then is I have to change my inputs a little bit. So these are all using the scroll button, but I need to switch that to, it needs to be an interaction. And that's not correct. So I've got to, it's got to have two things going on. So let me see here. I think I have to add a binding with a modifier. So I'd have to go through and do it with every single one. Or I could rename these and then, why don't I not rename them since they're, I'm not going to rename them because I have to rename them in the code, so I'm going to simply add a binding with the modifier and like Ctrl Scroll Up or something like this. And the modifier is the control button. And the binding is going to be the mouse down. Scroll down. So now I'm going to yank this scroll down And I'm going to see, because the same exact event is hooked up in the code for us. All we did was change which buttons you push, so everything should stay the same, as long as I set this up properly. This will stop me from zooming out without holding control. So let's see if this works or not. Okay, so not zooming out, if I hold control, sweet, working. So I have to go through here and tweak all of these to do the same thing. Yeah, let's see if I can modify this. No, okay. Oh, and actually, good point. I can probably copy this. And then come up here and just paste it in or something like that. Very good. And it is the exact same thing. Except for this needs to make sure that this is mouse up. And I should probably name this correctly. Okay. Whoops, what did I just do there? Okay. So let me go back to here, copy. I wasn't exactly planning on having a zoom functionality in the first place. If there's a camera pan, though, it makes sense. You can zoom out some. The only other thing I could consider would be I could consider would be like the idea I had was using Cinemachine to control camera orbiting, and then in that instance you might not need a zoom functionality. The Cinemachine also does have a booming feature for the camera, which is effectively what I'm imagining making which is a zoom feature, zoom or orbiting feature, both of which Cinemachine help you set up. Which means I really don't want to build that stuff. I'd rather just use Cinemachine for that stuff. Instead of learning Cinemachine at this exact moment, what might be most prudent would be to create an active scan object. Which means it's going to come down to how is it going to render in space, I could effectively build a ring object, and the thing though is that its rings would have to shift over time from starting point. Well, I guess it wouldn't matter if you just use the physics system. So I can make one and apply force to it and send it on its merry way. And if it hits something, well, I guess the problem with that is that it won't expand radially the same way. So it's gonna have to expand the rings by some kind of lerp thing. So it's gonna have to lerp from start to max, or from start to designated range that far, like there's maybe like divide it by frequency or multiply it by frequency to change the t value for the lerp. And you can essentially lerp the mesh over its lifetime. And that lifetime is changed by the frequency value. But that also means that it travels faster. It goes the same distance in less time, which can effectively, which means that I don't know if it's a good idea to rebuild the mesh every frame, but it's got to change its radial, it's got to cover the area far out, basically. Whereas if it's just one object that doesn't grow and just goes in a direction with the physics system, it will not do that. And it needs to have it needs to trigger a collider. So I guess it has to have a collider, but it's only a trigger collider flying through space. It's not a collidable collider. And it just renders these planets that are turned off whenever the scan collider hits the planet's collider. And if the scan hits something that's like needs a higher frequency, it can throw up the thing. It can throw up a UI element, but for simplicity, I can just probably set it up to make it discover the 2 planets I've turned off. But it's going to have to throw out a scan ring, or an active scan. So I guess, okay, so I guess what we can call it would be active scan ring. So I guess we can't go in here. There's an active player scan, is that? It's not the same thing as a prefab. That makes sense, or I might need specifically the active players scans, but let's create a new one called, which is active scan ring. Or active scan form, how about that? And this will need to be on a game object and turned into a prefab. It's probably going to need to have its mesh built. So I'm going to have to use my mesh formulator class. I don't have to do it like this. It's going to need a mesh renderer. And it's going to have to, that's material, not a mesh. I'm trying to go to the mesh filter here. So I'm not sure why I'm tripping on this exactly. For some reason I thought I needed to put the mesh renderer there. Instead we're going to build the mesh from our whatever we generate here. And essentially we essentially just want, well, I guess the mesh changes, doesn't it? I'm not sure. I feel like update loop is the only place I can make this work. Maybe I could also okay, so rebuilding the mesh every frame might not be great, but effectively that's what's happening. So it's like it really wants to be a shader. It's something where I want it to be running this conditionally, but not necessarily. Okay, so if I go the update route, I'd have to use destroy, and I would have to destroy them, which wouldn't be pooling them intelligently. So I hesitate to do the destroy thing. So basically what needs to happen here is the game object position doesn't really actually have to change, it's just changing the and it basically works on the in-game with the scan ring. We saw in the other video that we were throwing out areas of a mesh, but that wasn't doing it. That wasn't doing it of its own volition through the update loop, though. And I'm gonna have to lerp. I'm lerping from. What is a lerp return of float? So, I guess more specifically, So now I'm running into an issue where I might be trying to use my static mesh generator class in multiple places incorrectly. I can't rebuild the mesh if actually I just thought of something. I might be able to just increase the scale of the initial mesh. Which would effectively increase its colliders. So I'm going to try that. Okay, so we basically are going to need 4 rings. And those 4 rings will create an area. And it will... So we need to... We're adding a ring form. Or are we adding a ring surface? Okay, so we're adding a ring form, which is a array of arrays of vector 3s, which are effectively what our rings mount to. Separate vector 3 groups. And we want to pass in our ring measurements to build these rings. So from here, the mesh formulator now has been added a mesh configuration of our specification. Just not sure if that's going to work. I don't know if the scaling thing is going to work properly. If I'm moving something every frame, the idea would be to just use the physics system. And you can part of the problem here is that it's really wants to be a shader because it's got to, like, every frame calculate how far it is away. And, like, that's like getting into shader territory per pixel. So perhaps the only thing I can think of is putting it in the update loop and updating its mesh every time, but for that I would have to I'd really want to store the values, or I suppose I already did by using a mesh. I'd have to get the mesh's values and rebuild them. Alright, sorry about the silence. I don't want to return a mesh, I just want to return the entire array of vertices for I'm not sure how to do it without a separate instance. I don't want to redeclare a new mesh every single tick. This makes more sense on initializations, but not for every frame. So I don't know if I want to return a mesh. I really just want to return a vector 3 of vertices, which is my vertices list, but this gets into issues if multiple things are using this. Same concept though, I suppose. One way or the other, you're either using two classes or using one in two places. The idea is that this returns a vector 3. And we're grabbing the meshes vertices that are built through. Once again, we're wind up declaring this vector 3 array every time. So part of me wants to go like this. Let's say void, and then out vector 3 array. Vertices, basically. So I have to say vertices equals something, and they essentially equal our vertices.to array. So I have to change this. Something like this. And then from here we can be past the array we want to assign to, and then, which I'm not sure if I can do that because it's a mesh vertices. Let's see. And we basically, this is essentially needs to produce the same result as adding a ring form. So we effectively need a vector 3 array of rings, which is the same thing as just accepting a build rings. So I can't remember if I put the out before or after these, but let's check. So we are now going to need a ring measurements array, ring measurements. And we use this to say add ring form. Build rings, ring measurements. Now our okay, so almost what I want to say call this is rebuild mesh. And make this a mesh. Call this rendered mesh or something. And more or less we want to actually say, we basically want to do this without declaring a new mesh. And hopefully this will. So I'm going to have to do this. As long as I'm allowed to ref a mesh. Doing measurements are structs when we pass them in. However, on the outside, this is going to have to rebuild these rings anyway. Because, like, the rings... The rings are going to have to change all their radii basically every frame. And the lerp effectively dictates that change. So there's got to be a place in the other code, I suppose, where we can pull that off. But this will do the math without... I better clear the... collections. And I'm hoping that'll be a little easier on the memory, as opposed to just literally having an update loop run the mesh formulator every time with the new mesh instance every time. Alright, so now we have to go in here and attempt to whip up a mesh with this. So we don't want to run it... Well, I guess let's start... I don't know if it really needs to... I guess it's going to have to one way or the other. So the ring measurements could start with a radius of 0. But then... I'm going to have to do it in the update loop anyway. I've got to do some kind of lerp. So like... It might not be a bad idea to run as a job also. Man, this wants to be wants to be a vertex shader so bad. Because all you're doing is like all the CPU should have to do is change the radius. However, I'm still a little iffy on setting it up like that. Not sure if I need to like I mean, I might be able to use a shader graph for it. I guess part of me wanted to avoid the going down that route and just stick with prototype, but I just understand. I just happen to understand that it's designed for this exact problem. So for now, I'm just going to see if it tanks or not. That basically every frame the ring measurements have to change their radius by some kind of mathf.lerp floating point value, which starts at the scan origins center for simplicity and the maximum range of the scan set by the player. Iterated by t value. Which is sort of the t. Well, I guess I could use a timer. It's basically the t is actually distance, like divided by frequency, and that's going to decrease the t value. So we're going to need a couple things here. I'm going to need okay, so I'm starting to feel like what I'm going to need is the player data. And I need to learn how to do something real quick here. If I push Control, I forgot the hotkey arrangement to open this up. Okay, I'm trying to open it up all the way, not just... I could do that. Just add something. That's Alt F12, kind of strange, but okay. I guess something like this isn't too bad if I use my right thumb. So let's see. I need to get the... I suppose what I could do is have a... maybe have a reference to a global scanning capacity. Or no, it's not scanning capacity, is it? It's just... I'm trying to remember this real quick. What was the... is this one player chooses? I thought so. Player click selection button. Or maybe it wasn't that, maybe it was... Active scanning elements. Okay, so the active scanning element has a slider, which is active scanning radius total, which is what the player has selected using their slider. So now the scanning radius slider, and at any point the slider changes its value. Alright, sorry once again for the silence. I'm giving this some thought here. So I've got the scanning radius. Whenever the scanning radius changes, this is going to change the lerp's maximal value. So I've got to, upon changing this, update effectively. The easiest thing I can imagine is just coming in here and saying public. Let me come in here. Say public. Or no, I can't do a scanning capacity. It's not about. Okay, so if we give it an active value, it very easily can just pass the data. It can hold the data for when we need it. Considering if there's any other way to arrange the data. Something has to store it whenever the... Well, I guess it doesn't. I guess whatever... We don't have to store it, do we? We could, in fact, just... Okay, so we could overall have 2 references to the slider in memory, or 1 reference to the slider in memory, and an extra float in memory. So for simplicity, I'm just going to add it here. So active scanning radius and public float active scanning frequency. And we might even need public float active scanning angle. I'll separate these down 1 layer. And actually have player data open over here, now that I noticed. And, okay, so we've got to do 2 steps. The scanning radius value that we declared privately inside of this behavior, we are actually just going to replace all of that with the player data version. And this is going to give us the ability to have other systems leverage this value also, which in this instance is our scanning ring, or our actual active scan. Same thing here. And now we're just doing all data references through the player data. And it's essentially the same thing, but all we've done is exposed the active value here without having to make whole new references to this, to the whole new references to the slider through the UI and everything. So now effectively, man, I just feel like this is going to get really gross once we have multiple scans. But effectively, we have to lerp the... Alright, well, we would have to lerp the starting position, which is in fact the player data's active scanning radius object, dot position. Let me see here if it's a lerp. Okay, so in this instance, I have to do more math on the outside. But the position is, this is where the position actually comes from, is the center of our ring. And the end position is essentially that position minus the, or it's like, we might have to try to use a cross product between the arc. I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to think about that a little bit more. So this is where this is at for now. Sorry about this video. This was a very, very slow video. I was excited about the scanning system coming together, so I know I kind of droned on about that. And I'm trying to stick to prototypity, but there's a lot of stuff that just begs to like be a shader. So I was kind of indecisive in this video, I have to admit. So if you managed to watch the whole thing, I appreciate it. And I've got a lot more work to do to set this up, so I'll see you next time.